Hello, this is Mocha Product Manager Martin Brennand, and welcome to this tutorial on the Insert Region of Interest tool, or the ROI tool for short, which is what it's called in the interface. This is an underutilized but extremely effective tool within the Insert module. So we're going to go over where it is, what it's used for, and the best places to use it. So let's dive right in. So let's talk a little bit about one of the most common things you do in visual effects work, and that's get rid of civilization in an otherwise clean landscape. So in this particular shot we're looking at in Premiere here, we've got a whole bunch of roads and farmhouses and things near the lakes that we just want to get rid of to make this look like a pristine environment. So we can either add new things in or keep it clean for various other reasons. So now keep in mind I am in Premiere, but this works in any particular host or even in Mocha standalone. We're not sort of doing anything here specific to Premiere, we're just in Premiere for the fun of it. So I'm going to drag in my Mocha Pro effect, and we're going to start by opening up this shot inside Mocha. Okay, so here we are inside Mocha. Now, the first thing you want to do anytime you're about to track a shot is actually check the shot and make sure there's nothing in the way that's going to cause a problem. So we'll scrub through their timeline here. And we can see down here in the bottom right, we've got a bit of a shiny lake here. So as the camera moves, it's causing a reflection. So we're going to avoid that while we're tracking. Now I should point out, I am in the classic mode. If you've started up Mocha and it's looking like this means you're in the essentials mode. So you want to switch over to classic for this mode because the insert module is only available through that classic view. So let's start by tracking this shot. I'm going to come up to my trusty X-Spline tool up here and here, and we're going to go and draw a big old shape around the area we want to track. Now, this may be overkill for this shot because there's quite a good bit of texture in here, but let's be nice and sure. You can see here I'm avoiding that reflective lake so that we don't have any problems there. And we'll turn on a surface just to see what it's doing. Now, we're not going to modify the surface in this instance, but if you do ever modify your surface and you're not happy exactly where it is, you can just right-click that surface and click Reset to set it back to the bounds of the spline. Alright, this is a big perspective move, so I'm going to turn on perspective in my motion parameters. We're going to leave mesh off. This scene is not that undulating and there's not a lot of hidden features in here, so mesh is probably overkill for this, but we'll do a track first and see how it looks. So we're going to speed up the recording here while we're tracking, just so that you don't have to sit through the whole track, and we'll come back when we're done. Okay, our track is done, so let's have a scrub through and see how it looks. And that's looking pretty solid. Now this is a fairly easy pan, we're not doing anything super spectacular here, but we're doing this mainly because it's a big sweeping move and we want to talk about sort of perspective changes and things like that, which is why we're here. So, I've done that first page. Now, what we want to do is create our clean plate, because we want to be able to insert a painted out version of this shot. And this is the most common use for using the region of interest tool. You've got situations where you need to use the whole clean plate as opposed to an individual section. A lot of people are used to using the insert module for basically inserting little logos or things like that within the bounds of that surface, so then you can manipulate it with corner pins or however you like. Whereas a lot of people need to use it for clean plating, so being able to take a whole frame and then paint it to a particular region. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So I'm going to go over now to the remove module. Why are we going to the remove module? Because I need to get a frame out. Now you can do this any way you like. You could take a snap if you've already got a still, like you're working with an image sequence, you could do it this way. Here I've got a clip, so I need to take a frame out. And the quickest way to do that in Mocha is just to create a basic clean plate. So I've got my layer 1 selected, and over in the remove module, I'm just going to click create. And we're going to create a blank clean plate. So let's just call this, I've already made this one, but we're going to do it again so you can see, mountain road clean plate, or something like that, something distinct that you know where it's from. And then we can take that plate over to Photoshop. It's a 32-bit file, so it's nice and big and heavy and you're not going to lose any information. And then we can clean that up and then bring it back in. So once we have our clean plate inside something like Photoshop or whatever paint program you prefer to use, you can just go ahead and use the clone stamp tool and your various cleanup tools to do what you need in this shot. And keep in mind that you can do this to paint on stuff. So if you need to add, texture or dirt detail onto someone's face or things like that, you can do that all within this still plate as well, and then bring out the alpha. Here we're going to be just using the RGB. So we would zoom in, let's just take it here, I would use the clone stamp tool, big soft brush, and then start painting stuff out. So we're not going to go through that whole process because you should know pretty well how to do that if you're working in this area, but we'll take it back in and then show how we utilize this plate. So now we have our painted image, we need to bring it back into the shot. So we come over to our insert clip, go to import, click choose, and we can then import it in. You can also use this in the plugin via the insert layer method, but here we're going to do it directly via the disk. So I'm going to click import, and there's our painted shot. Now you can immediately see the problem here. We've got one large painted clip, but it's sitting inside that small surface area. Now normally what we would do here is we would click the align surface tool. So let's do that. And we have now got the surface matched to the dimensions of the footage. This is good for some situations, but when you're dealing with big, large, sweeping motions, and let's just go through here, what we're doing is significantly distorting that plate over time, and any subtle variations that are in the track will get scaled with that surface. So it can lead to some issues when you've got subtle variations that you may have missed in the track. So when we use this, we have to be very, very careful with our masking and all that kind of stuff, because we want to make sure that the surface is matching correctly. So let's just undo that. I'm going to right click and go back to reset and reset that back down to where it is at the bottom here. So let's drag over. I'm first going to make my surface fit just outside the spline area. So we're going to make it nice and chunky around like so. So it's just sitting outside, so we've got a little bit of outside edge on that spline. The next thing we want to do is go over to the insert module. And we have a whole bunch of tools in the insert module that you may or may not use, but the one that we want to look at the moment is over here on the left, which is the source tab. And there's our ROI and the region of interest section. Now the only thing we need to focus on in this entire thing is this top button. Fit ROI to surface. So let's click that. So what happened here? Basically what's happened is we've taken the entire clean plate and we've cropped it to where the surface sits. And you can see this subtle red line now sitting around the edge of this surface. That is the region of interest tool that is sitting in there. And we can modify this by using these parameters here, but for our purposes we just need it to sit within the surface. So now our clip is contained to just the surface crop mask. Okay, so let's scrub through that timeline and have a look. And we can see we're getting a nice even match within that spline area. Now obviously over this side we're going to get a problem because this wasn't on the same plane. So we're going to mask that out. Let's come back over to the comp and we're going to choose, well we can choose all layers because we've only got one layer here, but if you had more than one layer in your shot you could come down and pick one. But I'm going to use all layers in this instance. And we're going to feather this out a little bit too, because this is why we created a slight boundary around our spline shape. So I'm going to make sure I'm on my keyframe here. If you're not on the same keyframe, you can also turn on the Uber key here, but I'm going to just use the first keyframe. And on the outer of our edge offset here, we're just going to bump up our feather a little bit, so we get a nice blend. So let's just go through and see how that looks. So you can see now we're getting a nice, easy playback on that shot. So I'm going to zoom out a bit. Let's just turn off our overlays. You can turn off the overlays with the tilde key, but up here you can just use this little screen button here. Sometimes it's the back tick too on some keyboards. And then we can preview and just see how that looks. And that's looking pretty good. So now we can take this and bring it back into Premiere, or we can render it out. So let's just close and save. And now here inside Premiere, I can just come over to my rendering. I'm going to go down to my module renders. Let's choose Insert Composite, and then choose Render. I'm just going to pre-render this. Let's go ahead and press Enter. And there we go, we're playing it back, and we can see a nice clean shot on this particular road removal. So this is a fairly simple example. So the next thing we're going to do is show you a little bit more complicated paint out using PowerMesh tools and the insert module. So why does the region of interest tool work so well in this particular area? It's because now we have a lot of control over exactly where that perspective shift is happening. If I drag this surface here, you can see that I'm just manipulating the corners of the area I'm working with, as opposed to a large shape which would be much harder to manipulate at this stage. When we work on the PowerMesh example, you'll see how this is extremely powerful for being able to modify and warp the surface as well. So we're going to be over in After Effects this time, and we're going to be looking at this shot where we've got a fairly large Louise tattoo sitting on the back of this woman's shoulders that we want to get rid of. But the problem is we've got some shoulder blade movement, her tattoo is twisting over time, and also the bathing suit is twisting as well. So in order to do this, we need a more complicated insert to get rid of it. We've also brought in our painted plate. So again, this is just a PSD file I brought in from Photoshop, but it's a single plate here, we can see. And I'm going to bring that into Mocha via the Insert Layer tool. So here, if we go back to the top clip, we're going to apply Mocha Pro. I'm going to come up to Effect, let's come down to Mocha, and let's grab Mocha Pro. And now before I go into Mocha Pro this time, I'm going to come down to my module renders, and under my insert layer, I'm going to bring in that painted plate. And again, this is just the way to get it through the host. You could also just bring it in directly via the disk in Mocha. So now let's open Mocha Pro. So as always, the first thing we want to do is we're going to zoom in here, and we're just going to look at the motion of our track here. So we've got a fair bit of motion going on the thing here. We also want to avoid some of the light and shadows going on over here because they will throw off our track a little bit. So I'm just going to focus on the tattoo area. We're going to draw another X-spline up here, and we're just going to go around and focus on the bits where our tattoo exists. So I'm going to get quite close to this time, just around there, like so. And we're going to keep this close because we just want to focus on the tattoo area. So we're going to smooth this out. I'm going to right click on this and just smooth it out a little bit. Right clicking all the handles smooths all the points at once when you're dragging. And now we're going to do a mesh track instead of a perspective track. I don't need perspective in this shot because she's not actually moving away or towards the camera all that much. So we only really need shear in this instance. But we are going to use mesh. Now this is a fairly low res mesh here, so we're going to go over to our mesh generation tools here. I'm going to turn off vertices on spline and go over to adaptive contrast and then click generate mesh again. And that's giving us a pretty good result, but let's try making this about 16 instead. So that gives us a lot more detail to work with. Yeah, that's focused nicely on all those tattoo points. So now we just come over to auto smooth this. So we're going to go there and then start tracking forwards. And again, we're going to fast forward this so you don't have to sit through the track. All right, so we've done our track now, so let's just scrub through and we can see all that subtle motion coming in there. We've got the shoulder blade just tweaking that O area, and that's moving really, really nicely with the skin. So now we want to clean it up. So we're going to bring in that clean plate. Now this time we brought it in through the plugin. So we're going to come over to our insert clip and choose insert layer, not import. And once again, we have that same issue. We've got our little surface containing a large painted plate. So what we're going to do is exactly what we did last time. We're going to turn on our surface And this time I'm going to come over to the insert module immediately, so it's a bit easier to see what's going on. This hides the mesh immediately, so it's easier to work with your surface. So we'll zoom in a bit, and once again we're going to do that same thing. We're going to come outside. Oops, I moved the spline there. If you're worried about moving the spline, you can just turn off the layer outlines, and that will hide the splines as well, and just keep your surface up. So we're going to drag this down, just again, to cover all the areas where our problem area is. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger up here. We may need to do a little bit of extra roto keyframing here just to smooth this out, but we'll see. So let's just turn on our layer outlines again. That's pretty good. I'm going to drag this one out a little bit further because we want to have that border so we can do some blending. So let's just push out here and down. Oops, I did that again. See, this is why we like to turn off the outlines. There we go. All right, so that's nice and big. So once again, we could do the whole align to surface part here. And here I'm going to show you why you don't want to do that. So let's just zoom out again. I'm just pressing Shift 8 for that to get our star key. The star key is the thing that zooms us out to full. And we can go ahead and do that align surface. Now, the problem with doing this is that we want to warp this shape with the power mesh. And the warp down here, power mesh warp, it is warping the grid warp. So this grid warp mesh here, you can see the problem here. The grid warp is now the entire size of the footage. And this means we don't have any localized grid to be able to adjust as we go. So let's just undo that and go back to this one. And now you can see the grid is super small. This means we've got a lot more subtle control over our organic shape here while we're working. So I'm going to go ahead and do exactly what we did before. Let's just turn off that grid warp so we can see what's going on. And I'm going to go over to my source tab again. And once again, we're going to click our fancy button, fit ROI to surface. And boom, there we go. We've got a nice smooth shape inside that surface now. So we're going to do exactly the same thing as we did before. We're going to make sure we're on our first keyframe where we drew the shape. And I'm going to use edge offset to just blend out that shape a little bit. We'll be doing a little bit more on this because there's a bit more light variation in this shot. So I'm going to make that quite large. And we'll see how we go with that. Now, the second thing is when you're working with PowerMesh and Insert is that you want to make sure that PowerMesh Warp is on, because PowerMesh Warp is the rig that is essentially driving our grid warp. So if we look at that grid warp here and we scrub through the shot, you can see how the PowerMesh is going through and warping that grid over time. So let's just turn all that off for a second. Let's just turn off our layer overlays and see how that looks. So that's looking pretty good. Obviously, we need to still do the matte. So let's come back to our comp. We'll use all layers again. And let's scrub through again. And that's not too bad. We're going to need a little bit of softening down here where the blend is happening and the light is changing. So let's come in and have a look at that with our spline tool. So I'm going to turn on my surface and my layer tools again. And we'll turn off our grid warp here. So down here, we're going to need a bit more softening. So I'm going to select any point. I'm going to hold down my Alt key just to drag out any points that need further softening out. So we'll select this guy, hold down Alt, drag out. And this is just going through and making sure that we're getting enough blending through that bottom area. And the same goes up for it here. I'm going to make sure that this is blending down, so I'm going to animate this down a bit. We're just going to make sure that this blend is a bit shorter so it doesn't take in that tattoo, but we're not going over the edge of her shoulder here. So there, we'll bring that down, we'll bring that one down, and that's not looking too bad. So let's just zoom out again and we'll play that back. Scrub through, and that's not too bad. So let's just close up and save. And then once again, we do what we did in Premiere, but we're doing it here in After Effects now. Insert composite, check render, and there's our playback. So now let's talk a little bit about the advantages and the disadvantages of the Insert ROI tool. The biggest advantage should be pretty obvious by now. We've got an area of control if we turn our grid wheel back on here, where we can now very subtly change stuff over time. So if I come back to, say, for example, here, I can go and manipulate just individual points of this texture now if I want to, as opposed to having a whole broad surface where I can work. If we go in and have a look at, say, a smaller level, let's go down to level 2, this gives me much more control over exactly where the curve of that texture is going to sit. And this is especially useful when you're working with overlays. So if you're putting in alpha tattoos, or you're sticking in dirt, or things like that, you've got a lot better control over the manipulation. And we have a couple of tutorials we can show you on that process if you want to see. We'll put some links in for this video. The other advantage is that you can work with the whole plate. And this is obviously the biggest advantage. It means you can control and paint on whatever you like without having to consider where that surface is going to be in the shot. You can just deal with the entire plate and not have to worry about the bounds, because you're doing the bounds at render time. Now, some disadvantages. When we're working with the insert module, we are working with a single plate. You can obviously bring in animated plates if you want to, and you can drive that through the insert layers. But this means that any subtle light variations in the shot would have to be color corrected afterwards. So we don't do any color correction straight in the insert module. You could do that with the remove module, for example, using the illumination tools. So if we look over at the remove module here, we do have the option of using illumination modeling to change with the lighting as it goes, but you don't get the subtle changes that you do with the insert module inside the remove module. Another way to get around this would be to use stabilize warp and stabilize unwarp, because then you can stabilize the whole plate, paint on it, and then rewarp it back into position. So then you get all the light changes as well. But this gives you just another tool in your toolbox to be able to easily manipulate sort of surface data directly onto your tracked shapes. So that's the Insert ROI tool. It's a very small button, but can have a big effect on your insert workflow. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments, or pop over to borisfx.com, where you can check out more Mocha Pro tutorials and the other Boris FX products. I've been Mocha Pro Product Manager Martin Brennand. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.